So yeah, I'm glad I got to talk to you. I have seen, I watched some of your videos and I've seen your discussions with other people. I've been talking about the stuff I talk about for, I don't know, a couple of years now, I guess. But I've never really had the chance to talk about it with anyone with an economist. I've talked about it with sort of people who have lay knowledge of economics, and I'm curious to run these ideas by someone who is more formally educated in economics, which I'm certainly not, and to see what you think of it.
Let's do it. Sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun. Let's start us out however you'd like.
Did you do your homework?
Honestly, I didn't have a ton of time in order to research. I usually try to prep as much as possible for these debates, but my excuse is that I work full time. So I'll just go a little bit off the fly. I did watch the video you sent me.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yes, I did have time to watch the video. That's something I did do.
Yeah, that's cool. That was the only homework I was talking about. Cool. So what did you think of that?
I think in general, it probably, so the idea of anarcho-capitalism as a legal system, I suppose, the market for law, as seemingly proposed by, I think David Friedman is Milton. I think his name's David, if I'm not mistaken. It seems like it's assuming quite a lot. For instance, I think the largest assumption that he makes is that violence is expensive. So the natural critique of anarcho-capitalism is, well, obviously, how do I call the police? How do I do all of these things that try to prevent, property or violent crimes from happening to me, right? And to which it seems like the contemporary response is you'll have competing rights enforcement agencies, right? And he gives the example of, well, what, naturally the response is going to be, well, what if you have two different rights enforcement agencies? You stole a TV from me and our rights enforcement agencies, they're going to devolve into violence, or what's going to happen, right? And, his response is violence is expensive, and actually people aren't going to, these agencies aren't going to want to do that most of the time because it's expensive. I think that that's not really true in a lot of cases, and I think in a lot of cases violence is actually quite profitable. And that's why we see violence across the course of human history, right? It's a rational calculation that people have made in many instances to enact violence upon other people or other peoples. And I think, unfortunately, that's probably the end result of many of these arbitrations. I would just be quite skeptical of the idea that a rights enforcement agency wouldn't necessarily lead to, all else equal, more violence at an interpersonal level than we have today.
Okay, so you don't think that violence is generally expensive?
It's not a matter of if violence is expensive. It's a matter of if violence is profitable. And I think it's absolutely the case that violence can be profitable. And so long as that is the case, I think it's important to have some central and accountable agency by which we would look to enact such violence.
Okay, so you think that there's going to be like a viable business model that's just based on violence, on attacking people, and I guess stealing from them, or what?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, do you think? I guess my question would be, do you think? Well, why do you think things like slavery and colonialism have existed? Right. I mean, these are forms of violence that have been enacted on people because of various reasons. Why do people rob banks, right? I mean, these are things that I think that a rights enforcement agency, sort of a decentralized authority, would probably struggle with to some extent.
Okay, well, slavery and colonialism existed, thanks to the state. But I'll put that aside, and let's say...
Well, slavery didn't exist because of the state. Slavery existed because of people, right? The state just allowed that to happen, right? Now, you're right in the sense that sometimes states enslave people, right? But in a world absent any state regulation, by that logic, the state also abolished slavery, right? So I'm not sure it's the best argument for or against statism is the idea of slavery. My only point was just to say that, hey, sometimes it's very profitable to enact violence on other people, enslaving people, imperializing them. We could ultimately chalk these up into state actors, but whether it's like state actors or anarchist communes doing the same thing, there can definitely be many calculations that end up being positive to enact that sort of violence.
So when it comes to slavery, we're talking about like American slavery, or probably most. We're talking about, so in order to have slaves, you need to keep those slaves like forcibly working for you and not, going off and living normal lives and getting jobs and defending themselves from you. In order to do that, in America, the cost of preventing slaves from being free was largely socialized, right? So if a slave escapes from your plantation, the state will go and catch them for you and bring them back at public expense. And the state will also stop other people from giving that slave a normal job or helping them escape or helping them defend their rights against you by punishing that other person for, colluding with the slave, which is also something that's socialized. So I would say that slavery, that kind of slavery, is only able to exist because the cost of it was socialized. If you imagine a slave, a slave plantation trying to implement slavery entirely on their own without any help from the state, they'd have to literally like imprison the slaves on the plantation. They'd have to build walls and armed guards and chain them up and everything. It'd be as expensive as keeping someone in prison. And it would no longer be, viable. It would be cheaper to just hire people to voluntarily work for you than to try to imprison them and force them to.
Well, and yet we've seen governments, and do that exact kind of thing before, right? Try to imprison people and keep them within the borders in order to be productive for whatever purpose they might have. Now, again, we can say
we
that,
have seen governments
well, that's right, exactly. And we can say that, well, that's the state doing that, right? But I think that what a lot of anarchists struggle to do, at least in my view, in my reading of literature and listening to debates, is try to differentiate between a state and just a large commune, right? Now, on one hand, we're saying, well, the state is a monopoly of violence, and a commune, by that definition, does not have such a monopoly, right? They have to compete for people to live with them. It's contractual to some extent. I do understand that, right? However, again, if we're talking about enslaving people, keeping them within your commune, and then enjoying the fruits of their labor, in exchange for whatever basic substance you have to provide to them, this is still a profitable interaction for them. And so my only point was just to say that I think that rights enforcement agencies, at least as described by David Friedman in that video, I think he's greatly underestimating the potential profitability of violence in this world that he's constructed.
Okay, well, I don't necessarily distinguish between a state and a commune or business that is as large of the state and has, I guess to qualify as a state, it would have to somehow maintain a monopoly over a huge territory. But really what it comes down to is just about the size and the mechanism that's used to keep a state, to hold a state's monopoly. That is simply not, they don't allow competition. But when it comes to violence, I mean, I still like to know what kind of violence would be profitable, unless it's violence to protect people's rights. But what kind of rights violations would be profitable in a stateless society? Doesn't seem like slavery would work.
Well, slavery would work, right? I mean,
how would you do it without the state?
Well, the state isn't like what the state is not is like a group of people that have guns and force people to do what they say, right? The state, at least under most anarchist definitions that I have found, is a monopoly of violence, right? They are the only ones with the right to enact violence upon other people, right, or upon other entities, right? And so, understanding that, the thing that keeps a slave is not the state, it's people with guns and infrastructure to keep them as slaves, right? And by that regard and by that logic, any sort of commune or community within an anarchist society could very much have slaves. And what makes that a profitable transaction, I understand that what you're saying is that, well, there's costs associated with slavery. You have to feed them. You have to give them some basic provisions. You have to probably have a lot of armed guards. You have to have walls and stuff like that. You have to have an apparatus by which to monitor them. I understand all of that. But what I'm saying is that the examples of slavery that have existed with those apparatuses. And the calculation that was made was that, in fact, that is a profitable transaction to make. And I get what you're saying. Well, a lot of those costs were socialized, but I do disagree with that to some extent. Again, slavery has been a function of the human experience for most of the time that humans have been around. Even before we had government apparatuses that were incredibly robust in nature. So that's one example of violence being profitable. Obviously, we can look at other sort of micro examples, people marauding and robbing banks and financial institutions, people stealing from homes and whatnot. I think that the David Friedman argument against these types of things was that, well, they wouldn't be able to have any rights enforcement agencies because they're thieves, right? And they wouldn't be able to essentially participate in civil society because nobody would be willing to interact with them because they don't want to interact with someone that is murdering and pillaging and stuff like that. But again, I think under a similar logic, we could say that nobody would do that because they'll go to jail, right? It seems like there's sort of an ostracization that's being relied on here, which I'm not sure is reasonable in the criminal mind.
Okay, so I can talk about all those examples, but I want to try to stick to one at a time here. So let's go back to slavery. Would you say that a person is generally more productive as a free person, an employee, than as a slave?
Yeah, I would say so.
So, in an economy where you have organizations that use slavery competing with organizations that use employees, you would expect that the organizations that use employees would be generally more successful, right?
That's a really tough question to answer. It probably depends, I would imagine, to some extent on the market, but I would say on the whole, yeah, I would say that you're probably going to end up with more productivity if you're using just a paid employee versus a slave.
Right. So it seems like a market then is a good way to prevent something like slavery, as long as you have the societies competing with each other. Like, I could imagine, because you're assuming that in order to be big enough to enslave people and with efficiently, you also got to be big enough so that you have to provide, basically, you have to be like a self-contained economy. So you're going to be paying the cost of those slaves not being productive, right? Of some of your manpower being like suboptimally taken advantage of. Whereas an organization that doesn't do that actually has everyone like voluntarily employed, is going to be more efficient. So, it seems like a free market is going to be a good mechanism preventing slavery, just as a world with many different nations competing with each other for citizens is a good way to prevent slavery. It's arguably how it's been done. And, making it easier to move between those organizations by making them smaller and reducing the boundaries between them seems like it would only help in that regard. So I don't see how this would be any worse. I don't see how we'd end up with any more slavery than we have today.
Well, again, I think that what we're assuming here is that markets are either perfect, or we're assuming that markets have some ability to necessarily entrench in every possible context, right? Which I'm not sure is true. So, for instance, I think that all I could say is that, well, here's a question that I could ask. Do you think that if we didn't have a law against slavery, if slavery was allowed, do you think we would have more or less slaves than we have today?
If we didn't have a law so if we had the state and the state made a law that said slavery was okay, then we would have more slavery.
Right.
I mean, that's kind of how we had it in the past, it seems to me.
Right. Yeah, and that's a reasonable conclusion. And so what I would say is that if it's the case that if we got rid of the law against slavery, there would be more slaves than there are today, what that implies to me, and of course an anarchist could probably say, well, literally the only reason anyone would ever own a slave is because of the state apparatus that surrounds them. But I don't think that that's true. I think that rather what we could probably say is that Yeah, there would probably be more people enslaved without the law than with the law, and not all of this, and perhaps even a majority of this, is attributable to some socialized cost of owning slaves, right? Because obviously you can't socialize all of these costs. In a world where you can't socialize any of those costs, there would probably be more slaves than otherwise. After all, this is why we've seen slaves in pretty much all, most of human history, right? Of various types. And so my point would be that this is somewhat of an unacceptable outcome. And this is an outcome that ultimately can exist in an anarchist system that I wouldn't personally be comfortable with. And if it can't exist in an anarchist system, it's probably because we have to enact some sort of external force on a society that's using slavery in order to prevent them from cropping up. And so, it seems like we might agree to some extent under that framework that external force is sometimes required. We would just disagree the best mechanism by which to enact that force.
So sorry, I don't understand. Like, I'm not really talking about, I really never talk about what can or can't happen in an anarchy. Because it doesn't, like, pretty much anything can or can't happen in anarchy, and anything can happen in a world with states as well. It just comes down to what will tend to happen. What do economic models predict will tend to emerge. So why would we expect to have more slavery in a stateless society than a stateless society with a state? Now, I guess if you're looking at a society right now, a state right now that doesn't have any slavery, then you could say, okay, well, there's zero slavery there. But then if you look at the whole world, I mean, there still is some slavery, but there's less and less over time. So in that case, it's like, why is the process that caused slavery to be unpopular and not infeasible in the world of the states not also happen in a stateless society? I mean, it seems like you'd have the same forces, but they'd be even stronger because it would be easier. People would be more competitive, and it would be easier for people to move between, if they're a slave somewhere, you'd go, across the street and you're emancipated, or something. Like, it's much easier than going to another country, right? It seems like slavery only works at a large scale when you can socialize the costs, and it's harder to socialize costs without a state. So,
well, no, I disagree to some extent with that. Well, you said easier, I suppose. I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it more, but I would just say that with regard to the slave example, right? Again, all that I would say is that states have shown an ability to enact popular will to such an extent that it can move the entire Overton window, right? So, for instance, if we assume that the state getting rid of slavery as a result of like the Civil War had no net effect on the public opinion of slavery, I'm not sure that's necessarily true. A less contentious example could be like the example of gay marriage, right? So when gay marriage became legal in all 50 states as a result of the court opinion, it seems to be the case that had a relatively direct implication of the entire country started to move a bit more quickly to being accepting of gay people and gay rights. And so in this regard, I think that states can be valuable as a force for regulation. And in a world where we have sort of infinite sort of fractalization of governments and communes and structures like that, what we would then be allowing is probably some portion of people to be governed under an authority which would allow them to go and kidnap people and enslave them as a form of violence, right? And I think that this is probably unreasonable. I don't think that's the best outcome morally, and it's probably, like you said, not the best outcome economically. The last thing I'll say is there's a lot of research that shows that slave economies are inefficient, right? That they're not preferable to like a more free market style system, but they still existed. The answer would be why, right? Or the question would be why. The answer would be, well, they existed because slave economies might be inefficient in terms of aggregate wealth production, but they're clearly efficient if your goal is to skim wealth from some people and add it to others. It's clearly profitable for some people to enslave others, although aggregately it might not be as efficient. This is something we can agree with, but as long as that is true, we would certainly see a lot of incentive to enact that violence on people and enslave them. And we'd probably see more of an incentive to do that under a non-stated society, in an anarchist society, than otherwise.
Okay, so let's try this. Could you like describe what a slave business, what a slave enterprise would look like in a stateless society? Like, how exactly would they do this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you would probably try somehow to kidnap other people, or rather to enslave children to some extent. Just somehow, some way you acquire these people, as they did in, I suppose, all of the other ways by which people became slaves. And then
what way?
You would use them. And for instance, in the African slave trade, it was a mixture, I believe, of kidnapping and selling people. That was one way. I think that in the ancient Greek times, it was pretty much essentially all the prisoners of war were slaves or serfs of some kind.
Okay, but in modern society, people have, if you go and kidnap someone, they'll call their rights enforcement agency and say, this guy's trying to kidnap me, come and can save me. How do you deal with that?
How do I deal with someone calling their rights enforcement agency?
Yeah.
Well, what is there to deal with? They're just making a phone call. What's wrong with that?
The enforcement agency will send people with guns to come and help and protect them. They're a security company.
I know. I'm not sure what is there to deal with in that scenario.
Wherever you are, where that person is, they're going to come and try to forcefully rescue them from you.
Oh, I see. So you're saying like how would
it's like calling the police and saying, "I've been kidnapped. Here I am. Come save me." Right?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was confused how you framed it. So you're saying like if I try to kidnap someone and enslave them, how am I going to deal with the rights enforcement agency coming up? Yeah. So obviously, I think that one way is just that the rights enforcement agency probably can't be as quickly reactive as I can be proactive, right? So it's probably a little bit easier to get the jump on someone and kidnap them than it is for the rights enforcement agency to just like teleport people to your house and get saved from there, right? And then at that point, they have to launch like an entire investigation. Where did this person get taken? We don't know. How do we get them back?
Are you going to hide? Sure. Like, is your whole business going to be incognito, and you're going to like hide people away so nobody knows where they are?
Well, I mean, I think that, the first answer to that question is that that's possible. You could do that. Obviously, there are examples of underground slave trades. Well, no, again, like, I think that the point that you're reiterating here that's kind of falling on some deaf ears, at least from my perspective, is that I agree that there's costs associated with enslaving someone that are not associated with hiring an employee, right? However, the big cost that's not associated with enslaving someone that is associated with hiring an employee are salary and benefits and workers' rights, right? And so under that same system, this is why many societies of the past have determined it a profitable venture to go and enslave people, although there are costs associated with enslaving people.
So you still have to keep, if you're imprisoning the slave, you have to keep them alive. You have to support them. And you may not have to give them a very high quality of life. You give them a low quality of life. But of course, then they're not going to give you a very high quality of labor. You're going to get only the simplest things you can be able to do with this slave. Now, the thing is, if this is just a firm in a society, not some sort of, if it's just the size of a company, then you're going to have to deal with the rights enforcement, infrastructure of that society. So the people who you try to kidnap, their rights enforcement agencies are going to come and enforce the law on you. They're going to take them back. And if they don't have that, then people will come up to them and be like, hey, you want to, I'll emancipate you and we'll send you a bill later. And they'll probably take that deal because it's a good deal for them. They can, once they're emancipated, they can make more money and then afford to pay that bill. It's a good deal for the people who come and emancipate them because they make a profit off that. They're creating value by getting these people out of slavery.
Oh, right. But you're assuming that those people are able to be found in the first place. You're also assuming that they have the resources to do so.
Well, so now you're talking about running an entire business where not only are the people like physically imprisoned, but they're even like informationally imprisoned where you can't even communicate with the outside world and no one can even tell that you're using slavery. This sounds so incredibly expensive. I don't understand how anyone would. I guess it's possible, right? Like it's possible to commit crime in any society if you can keep it entirely hidden, just like it's possible in a state. Like you could have a slave-run business in a society with a state if you can keep it secret from the state, sure. But I don't see how the state is, in that case, I don't see how the state is any better at preventing that than an anarchist society. Like the state has to be able to see that you're using slavery in order to stop slavery. So what's the difference?
The difference is that we can have a whole society that is made illegal to enact slavery, but we can have a subset of
But
a
it doesn't matter if
society
it's illegal if
where-
you're hiding it. If you're hiding it, you can get away from any legal system.
Well, I understand, but we're working within multiple apparatuses, right? So, for instance, right, I can imagine, this is one of the issues with these conversations, right? I can imagine an anarchist society that is perfectly okay with slavery so long as it's
Really?
people from other anarchist communes, right? And we might imagine an anarchist society that is both okay with enslaving other people, but also has the arms by which they can defend their business model to do so, right? And so, is so long as that sort of imagined scenario exists, which I'm sure is not the most insane imagined scenario, that's probably a result that I'm not really comfortable with in terms of forming a broader superstructure for society, right?
I mean, that's pretty
slavery is just one
far-fetched
example.
today, right? Like basically everyone in the developed world knows that that's wrong to enslave other races. But let's say they did. I mean, they're still going to have to pay the cost of that, right? And it's still
No, I understand, but we're not talking about like I suppose necessarily an incredibly practical implementation. By that regard, I could just say that, well, anarcho-capitalism will literally never be implemented because people don't want, anarchy, right? So it's not the most valuable conversation. I think what's more valuable is trying to test the outer limits of a system, and I think that a system by which their outer limit is a lot of the implications of anarchist capitalism is probably not the best system. If we don't want to talk about slavery, we can talk about the implications of like resource allocation, perhaps labor allocation, anything like that. I think there's a lot of examples of like anarchist society that would probably lead people to be at least somewhat uncomfortable with living in that society versus the one that we live in today.
okay. Well, I mean, I think it seems to me if you're talking about the scenario where everyone suddenly thinks slavery is good, well, if it's 51% of people, then in a state democracy that will make slavery happen. It seems at least as easy to make it happen with state. But okay, let's move on from slavery. What are the other issues that you see?
Well, yeah, I think with regard to that last bit, I think that at least with regard to a stated society, we can have a codified set of rules and go from there. Whereas there's not infinite compartmentalization and fractalization within a stated society. I think that that's really where you'd prevent some of those things from happening, at least in a more robust way than anarchist society. I can imagine a scenario.
How fragmented do you expect an anarchist society to be? It's not, because you sort of, it seems like you think of it as like a bunch of tiny little countries that don't interact with each other.
No, of course not. Obviously, you can have trade and interaction amongst different anarchist communes, and you can obviously have super communes and federalized communes. The idea of anarchism
or not even
isn't
communes
like
at
against.
all.
Yeah, sure, just individual actors. Yeah, I mean, the idea of anarchism, I think, fundamentally isn't like, it's not about just everyone being their own state or anything like that. Just their own property managers or whatever. It's more about the monopoly of violence and the use of coercion as a means to enact change. At least that's my reading. And so I understand all that. So there's not a misunderstanding there, I don't think. I just think that fractalization probably leads to some problems. For instance, obviously, well, here's a question that maybe could end. Every anarchist is a little different. If I lived in say that I lived in a community with 100 people and we all have our own house that we built. And let's say that we agreed originally to have some contracted community. So we contracted it out. We have a community agreement. And let's say that, 5 years down the line, there's some sort of opt-out clause and, I opt out. All of a sudden I'm one independent person within this community of 100. Would you say that that's would you say that that's reasonable, that that's okay?
Sorry, what kind of community is this?
Well, it's a community association, right? So we've decided to we've collectivized some things. We've built fences. We decide to bargain together for trash pickup and stuff like that, like whatever it might be. almost like just an HOA essentially.
Okay, I mean, this sounds like something that you could have in a state with or without a state.
No, I understand. I'm just saying that under this system, right, we would say that the laws by which that community is governed by, you can opt out of ultimately.
No, I don't know what you mean by the laws that they're governed by. Are you saying that this community involves some agreement about what rules they're going to follow?
Well, yeah. So again, anarchism is not against law and order, right? It's just a
No.
matter of how voluntary that law and order is, right? So you would say that
for me, it's just about choice, about competition, right? About not having one organization deciding all the laws and enforcing them all by itself. It's about people being able to choose who they want to enforce their laws, and then having the laws emerge through multiple companies competing in the same market and making agreements with each other how to resolve disputes and having to come up with a set of laws to do that with, right? Now,
but by that understanding, yeah, go on.
Like I could see it potentially how you could have some aspect of rights enforcement be handled by like communities of housing, but I don't see how that's necessarily. Doesn't have to be that way. Like people living in the same neighborhood could have different rights enforcement agencies. There's no particular problem with that. It's just a matter of what there's different ways of doing it. But so what is the issue? I guess you're supposing that they do have some sort of they do have a community which is responsible for some aspect of rights enforcement, and you're wondering what.
Yeah, so exactly. So what I'm saying, I'm just trying to ask you a question to understand foundationally how you feel about these things. You've already answered the question, really, so the hypothetical doesn't matter as much. So it seems like fundamentally, I guess your anarchism is based on choice, your ability to live under the laws by which you choose to be governed by, right? And just go from there. And so I think that that's where we probably lead to at least some problems, especially when you talk about people moving independently, and more like philosophical conversations of violence become a bit more prescient in that regard. So, for instance, like what gives someone the right to anything, really? Do you believe in rights at all, as a primer?
Do I believe in rights? I believe that rights exist. What I think they are. I believe that rights are a sort of emergent social phenomenon, something kind of like language that we've sort of collectively constructed through negotiation with each other in order to solve problems of cooperation and resolve disputes. That's what I think.
Why are you an anarchist? Like, why do you believe in anarchism? What's the reason?
Because I think that is. I think that we're at a point where there's many problems that we're not making progress in solving because states have taken exclusive responsibility for solving those problems. And I think that we're not going to make any progress until, we've generally, there's a general trend of solving problems through markets that we've seen over the last few hundred years, where markets and competition and individual and choice have been a extremely powerful mechanism for solving problems and improving the world. And I think that we sort of arbitrarily decided that there's a few industries that for some reason that mechanism won't work for, and so we have to let governments exclusively control that. And I think that there's no particular reason to think that.
Yeah.
And I think that, in fact, we're not going to make any progress in those industries unless we allow the free market to try and solve them as well.
Well, what are some examples of problems in society that cannot be solved by a state but can be solved by a market?
Well, it's not can or can't. It's just a matter of how well they're doing. And so the whole justice system is a good example of that. I think the justice systems that are provided by states are pretty awful. It's easy to imagine like vastly better systems that almost everyone would prefer a lot. And I don't see any indication that states are even capable of making progress towards that. It's just they don't seem to be capable of doing it. They don't have the incentives to do it. There's so many obvious problems with our justice system. The way police work they don't. Actually, I've made a list of all this stuff. Let's see.
Well, I mean, I think that at the same time that you said,
do I even have to spell it out for you? Like, would you agree that our justice system has a lot of serious problems?
Yeah, I would say that there's room for reform for our justice system, but I'm not sure that truth makes the leap to we need to have anarchism, right? So, what I would say is that
it's worth trying anarchism. That's really all I'm saying, right? I'm saying why we should expand our realm of possibilities for things we're willing to try beyond just the state solving this, which is seems like a fairly limited, list of things to try.
I guess so. I mean, in theory, we could say that a lot of things are worth trying under perhaps dire circumstance, but I'm not sure that, number one, the circumstance is quite so dire such that we should abolish the monopoly of violence the state has, and two, I would say that it's not necessarily the case that anarchism could even necessarily solve these problems better than the state could, right? Again, I think that what would help is pointing to like a specific example, right? It's one thing to say that just the justice system, right? But what's an issue that by like state policy has been poorly solved that you think that could be more optimally solved in an anarchist society? I guess you mentioned like police, right? Would police be an example where overly violent police forces, I guess, could be solved more by the market than by the state or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like police are really scary, right? Like even good people are pretty afraid of police. They seem to be pursuing kind of their own interests. And our rights, protecting our rights are more of like an obstacle to them rather than something that they protect. Our interests are just sort of a secondary thing that get in their way rather than try to pursue it. They sometimes protect us, but then sometimes they seem more like they're preying on us and trying to fine us, or just trying to charge us with stuff just so they can have someone to charge. They can tick off something on their form that says you made this many arrests. And of course, they don't police each other. They let each other get away with terrible stuff all the time. So it seems like we can do so much better than that. Compare police with security guards, right? You don't hear about like security guard brutality being a big problem because security guards actually have an incentive to serve their customers and to make them happy because their customers can go and switch to another security guard if they don't like their security guard. I want that same kind of choice with police because I think you'll get the same kind of improvement.
I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case, especially as a broad application. So, for instance, let's imagine a market for police, right? We've abolished the institution of police. It's all private now. So therefore, you have to either contract personal security if you want personal security, or you have to collectivize to some extent your investment in such a contract such that your community would have a patrolling police force, right? And let's say that, hey, you theoretically you did have the option for like the less armored, more community-oriented police if you wanted that, or perhaps the more diverse police force, like whatever type of police you wanted, you could theoretically buy. I think that some of the issues with this is that we'd probably see a lot of inequality in this system, right? Is that as much as people might have criticisms for the police or the fire department or public school teachers, I do think it's probably decent that every person, rich or poor, can call 911 if their house is on fire and get a relatively equitable amount of service from the fire department. And I think that it's also probably a pretty good thing that everyone can call the police if their house was robbed and get a reasonably equitable treatment from the police. Not that they do get a completely equitable treatment, but it's probably better than a system dictated by who has more money.
So right now, if you do the math, we end up, the cost of the whole justice system in America works out to something like $40 to $50 per capita for like every person in the nation. That's like the whole total amount spent on police, courts, and prisons. $40, or let's say $50 a month. It doesn't seem like a whole lot. And when you consider that, the cost of rights enforcement in a market is likely going to depend on what you have to protect, right? So protection for your own person is going to be cheaper than your own person plus a piece of property like a house or a larger piece of property like a business or whatever, right? Add to that, that's the extra efficiency that you likely get from having competition and not spending tons of money on wasteful things like the war on drugs and extremely expensive, prison system that doesn't actually produce anything good. And I don't think you're actually looking at a whole lot of money for like the poorest people. If they don't have anything to protect, they don't own any property, which could be easily the case for someone who's like just renting, then they're probably looking at like a few bucks a month just for basic security. Plus, and if you can't afford that, you're always going to be like, if you're homeless, for example, you're always going to be on someone's property, whatever you're doing. I mean, that's what to do with yourself is a problem. But if you're on someone's property, they're going to have some sort of security that's going to stop crimes from happening on that property, right? If it's like a, public property or like a public area, there's going to be security guards that are going to give you some degree of protection if you're homeless. So it's not clear to me that, you'll have to pay for security and different people will have to pay for as much security as they need. But it seems like the more you only need to protect what you have. So people who have more will be the ones who have to pay more to protect what they have. That seems like a more fair system and something that's going to give people more protection than what we have now. It doesn't seem like the law actually does a very good job of protecting poor people right now for many reasons.
Well, I think that there's probably some things that are underlined in that type of analysis that let me put it this way. So if it was really the case that every community member putting in $40 a month could basically fund an entire police force, why don't we see poor communities just buying their own private security, right? I mean, if private
they're already paying
security
for the public, and because the private security is not allowed to do much.
Well, no. Well, hold on. Well, they're allowed to do a heck of a lot, I suppose, right? So, again, if it's only $40 or $50 a month in theory for the entire justice system, let's just say that for your local police force, it's $25 a month because we're not including like courts and judges and lawyers and all that stuff. Let's be a little bit generous and let's say it's $25 a month. By that calculation, honestly, it's probably a lot cheaper than $25 a month, right? But let's just say for $25 a month, the city of 2 million could fund its entire police force if everyone pitched in the $25 a month, right? If it was really that cheap, the opportunity cost isn't really that high, right? And so the object of like, oh well, we don't really like our police, so we're going to collectivize and we're going to fund, a supplemental security force in order to patrol our streets and, do more regular day-to-day interaction with, wait outside of shops, all this kind of stuff. I feel like we'd see probably a lot more of that. And at the very least, I would say that the answer is probably a bit more complex than simply cost. I think that we would end up with probably a lot of inequalities in this regard. In general, if only for the fact that even if it was so cheap, there would probably be some areas of the country or some areas of cities or some areas, just whatever densely populated area, where the market would charge a lot more for in general, and it'd probably be charging a lot more for security in areas that need it the most, right? And probably areas that have the least ability to pay for them because they're probably the poorest communities. And so there's many, many different routes by which I can see a private police force or a private fire service or, a private school system, whatever it might be, ending up with a heck of a lot more inequality than we have today. That's probably not advantageous if we're thinking about, aggregate well-being.
So today, we do have lots of private security, and lots of people do hire private security to augment the inadequate state security.
But why don't poor communities do it then? Why is it always the poor communities that don't have the ability to do this?
I don't know. Do they not do it? Like, I haven't seen any stats on that. Maybe the ones for whom it's worth hiring security.
Well, hold on. Well, hold on, because let's be reasonable here, right? Because we're bordering on. It's just not reasonable to infer what you might be inferring here. Would you say that poor communities in America generally hire less private security than wealthy communities on a per person basis.
Sure. I
Right.
assume so.
Okay. Well, yeah, and that's all I'm saying, right? And that's all that I'm saying is probably would be cross-applied in a system with no police at all. Is we'd probably end up with poor communities that either didn't have the money to buy, didn't have money to buy police in general. They might not be supplied to that market because it's so expensive to police those areas, or we'd end up with a system where basically maybe they can afford it, but they're charged a lot more for their security than otherwise. And I don't think that that's necessarily a better system than we have today.
I don't see. Okay, so I assume that poorer communities hire less security because, well, they have less money, but also they have less to protect. The kind of things that they have to protect that are worth the same, like their lives, and things like that, they probably can't. It's probably difficult for private security to do that because because the state has a monopoly over those particular kinds of security, right? So whereas protecting property, I mean, they have less property to protect, and maybe they have the adequate amount of security to protect their property. I don't know. But if you're saying that, well, if private security were feasible, we would see more private security now, that seemed like a pretty weak argument. I mean,
if it were that cheap, I think we would probably see a lot more private security than we have now.
But it is that cheap. I mean, that we pay for that. That's how much we pay for it now. But we have to pay the state for it, or we pay more than that. So it's definitely possible to do it for that price.
No, I get what you're saying. I'd have to look into the numbers of what you're talking about, right? But my only point would just be to say that if we're talking about a pure market allocation system, right? And let me just do some math real quick. So if we're talking about a pure market allocation system, right? Naturally, this market would price based on probably the crime in an area. You're saying it would only price based on the value of the products in the area. That doesn't really make as much sense because obviously if you have a higher cost, right, the supply is harder to get to those people, you'd end up probably with higher prices, right? And so if you end up with a situation
why is the cost higher?
Because there's a lot more crime in that area.
Why is there more crime?
I mean, there's many reasons why there might be more crime. Some people say economic inequality. Some people say, in general, poverty creates more destitution, which creates more people desperate and willing to do crime. There's a lot of reasons why you can have high crime in an area. Well, what's your explanation?
I don't know, but I wouldn't assume that that's necessarily going to be the case in anarchist society.
Well, I mean, obviously, why wouldn't you assume that? Wait, hold on. What are you not assuming in this scenario exactly?
I assume that if this stuff in a neighborhood is less valuable, then there's going to be less stuff to steal. So there's going to be less theft, at least.
Well, but by that logic, the lowest crime areas should be the poorest areas of our society, but it's the exact opposite.
That's true, but we don't live in an anarchist society. We live in a state society. So why is that? That's a good question.
Well, no, I don't think that
I would tend to think that those areas are poor because of the crime.
Well, no, I think that crime probably doesn't. Crime does lead to some people being poor. Obviously, if you get robbed, you're poor either in the long term or temporarily because you don't have that thing that you used to have, right? But at least based on my reading of a lot of different things, that crime is less of a chicken and an egg problem and more so, how do I put this? Crime doesn't tend to happen totally exogenously, right? And so in that regard, poverty and many other superstructures tend to cause crime to some extent or another. And I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that under an anarchist society, we would see some like fundamentally different allocation of crime, in general, I guess.
Well, I mean, maybe not. Okay, fine. But the fact that in a state justice system, we have areas which are clearly underserved for rights enforcement, just seems like another good reason to say, well, maybe we should try something else. It doesn't seem like we have any sort of solutions down the pipe for that problem. In a market system, at least you would have a mechanism that these people could use to try to improve their situation, right? If there's an underserved market, then anyone can come up and they can figure out why that market is underserved. They can try to fix that problem and serve it. And people could spend the money to do that, So I don't see, it seems like it's at least willing, like we should at least give those people a chance, give them a chance to try other solutions to that problem rather than force them to stick with the state solution, which clearly isn't working because in some theoretical sense, we would have more inequality. Well, it seems like we got that inequality now.
Well, to be clear, with police, nobody's forcing anyone to have a police department, right? So a city is free at any time to disband their police department if they want.
Individuals are forced to, right? Like, I mean, you can move, but if you live in an area, you're stuck with the police of that area.
Well, sure, but I think that at this point we get into some, again, more philosophical conversations where, I would say that it's okay because, it's democratically determined that that's the will of that community. If you don't want to live in that community, you can always move. Whereas, I'm not sure if you would have a starkly different view.
I'm not talking philosophy. I'm just talking basic economics, right? Giving people choice is a good way to help them optimize what they get, right? People.
Well, right, but if we're just talking about choice, then they do have the choice to either vote in a different system by which they are governed in terms of the police, or they can move.
Okay.
Right. The market is dictating that to that extent.
So yeah, moving is a choice, but it has a lot of sort of side effects. You have to pay a lot. It's very inconvenient to have to move just to be able to switch. Like if you had to move to another city just to get a new cell phone provider, cell phone service would be much worse because it would be harder for people to actually exercise their choice. As far as democracy, for economic incentives to work, it's important that what you choose actually determines what you get as an individual. And that's not the case with democratic choice, right? Your democratic choice of who to vote for has actually very little effect on what you will actually get, right? Effectively none, and you have any sizable community. So that the economic incentives are not going to work in that case, at least not the way we think they work.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's necessarily true, right? So, for instance, right, you might say that proportionally, you don't have a lot of say in if there's a city of 3 million people and about half of those people are adults, right? 1.5 million people, let's say all of them vote, you might not have as much say as the broad populace does because you're just one person, one vote, right? But at the same time, in a broad market, your decision not to buy a peach probably doesn't cause the price for peaches to go down by that much, right? So at the same time,
but it causes you to not have to pay for the peach, which is what matters, right?
Right, and if you really value that kind of thing that much, you can always move out of the community, right? I mean, that's the thing. You can say that it's more inconvenient to do one versus the other, but ultimately you do have the choice. And my argument positively for the police as a structure would be that I think that having a sort of collectively funded and broadly accountable police force is probably better than having one that is I suppose, fragmented to some extent and compartmentalized to some extent.
Okay, well, I don't. I think it seems obvious to me that the choice is a far more powerful mechanism to hold services accountable. You said, like, you have the choice to move to another city. Well, what if you didn't have to do that? If you could change rights enforcement without having to disrupt your entire life, then you'll be much easier to exercise your choice, and you'd have much more power to influence the people providing you that service. That's the basic idea. And of course, what if it works for local services, and then on the national level, changing your national service means moving to another country, which is like almost impossible for most people, practically speaking. So.
Well, right, but functionally, what's the difference between, like, I want to move to this city with this job opportunity and they have a police force they contract with that I don't agree with, versus the opposite scenario where, oh, I don't like my local police department, so I'm going to either move or work within the system. It seems like these choices are fairly similar. I think the advantage of mine, however, is that one is like broadly subsidized and agreed on, and one is more compartmental in nature. I think that there's some markets where fundamentally they don't tend to work as well in a completely open landscape. And I think that police is probably one of them.
If your police force is coupled to where you live and where you work, then you can't change police forces without also changing jobs and changing homes. I want a system where those two are decoupled, where I can, without moving, without changing my job, choose to get my rights enforcement from some other different police force to serve me because I don't like them. Just like being able to choose cell phone service or whatever other service is going to be more effective if you don't have to disrupt your whole life in order to make a change.
Well, sure, but at the same time, we've been assuming that police is a perfect market, which I'm not sure we can assume that. But even, setting that aside for... Well, hold on. Let me just... setting that aside for a moment, right? I was just going to say that at the same time, though, it seems like we have a similar issue in your society as well, right? So we've got one society that contracts with a police force that I don't care for, and my 6-figure job is set in the city. Well, I'm kind of either forced to accept that situation or go from there. I'm under a collective even in that system either way, and so if my choice is either, hey,
in which
go with the collective, well, in your system, right? So if the choice is either go with the collective police force that my community has agreed on, or move, I mean, it seems like you're kind of saddled with the same burden either way.
You don't need a collective police force. You can have multiple police forces serving the same area, competing with each other.
Well, no, because what I'm describing is like a broad superstructure where, say that there's a commune with like 500,000 people or something, right? And there's this great job that I have just been offered and I need to go and live there, right? Well, now at this point, I'm either going to have to go with their chosen police force, or I'm going to have to, work at this low wage job that I've been used to, right?
I suppose you could set up a commune like that, but the point is you won't have to, right? So you could go and live in a community that tries to dictate everything in your life, but you're not forced to do that as you are now in today's society where everything works that way. At least we would have the option of not having everything coupled together, right?
Well, no, I understand the philosophy, right? All that I'm saying is that there's sort of a necessary choice. There's both a necessary choice and a necessary lack thereof practically of that choice in either system, right? So on your hand, you could say, yes, the markets might be somewhat imperfect. Yes, it might be the case that some communes are better than others and therefore can coerce people to live there, whatever. Ultimately, you don't have to live there if you don't want to. And under my system, what I would say is that, ultimately you can move out of the country, out of the state, out of the city if you want. Ultimately, you can vote on reforms for those systems if you'd like, and go from there. My point is that both systems are saddled with some of these issues. And I think that when we really boil it down, then it just becomes a question of, well, is the market really more efficient at delivering this good or not, rather than this sort of illusion of choice, which I think, it turns out we've inadvertently gotten bogged down into, where, there's problems with choice either way, but now it's more of a debate of, is the market actually more efficient at allocating this certain good than a singular sort of centralized entity? And in a lot of these examples, I think the answer is, certainly the answer is probably no, or at the very least, there's probably room for some state involvement and regulation.
Would you say that in the general case, markets are better at efficiently satisfying people's preferences than a central planning? The general case.
I would say that most of the GDP of a nation should probably be allocated by the private market.
Okay, so any particular market. So, if that's the general case, then there'd have to be circumstances in a market, special circumstances that would warrant not having a free market and using a central planning approach instead, right?
Well, not necessarily. Sometimes central planning, sure, just basically a collectivized or nationalized system, but then also sometimes probably just regulation as well.
Sure. So I don't understand. So what are the special circumstances in the market for justice, for police enforcement, or for arbitration, or whatever, that warrants the centralization or the regulation or the not having a free market?
Yeah, sure. If we want to talk about the, how do I put it? If you want to talk about the police and justice departments specifically, some of those issues could be a lack of perfect information, right? So there's probably some separation between like the legal scholars and the average person, and is this a good lawyer or a bad lawyer is probably a pretty difficult thing for the average person to do on a free market. And so, that's one thing. I think that on another end, we've probably got some amount of entry and exit problems. So, for instance, if I've got a local police force that's, a private police force that's like basically monopolized an entire area, sort of districted monopoly like we see in like the telecoms industry, it's probably going to be pretty hard to underprice them and go into that system and really undercut them, get them out. And so that's a structural barrier that would probably be faced by external police forces that would want to compete. These are the kind of things that I think would, probably plague a system of private enforcement of laws.
Is it that difficult for a person to judge whether they're getting good rights protection from a rights enforcement agency? Like, it doesn't seem that hard. Like, you can generally tell whether a security guard is doing a good job for you. Doesn't seem particularly hard, right?
Well, no. A security guard might be one thing, right? But holistically, like a police force is probably another thing, and then the actual accountability to those laws is an entirely different thing, right? So, for instance, evaluating whether or not a rights enforcement agency was able to adequately not only interpret the statutes by which they are governed by, but also actually represent your interests is probably something that's pretty difficult to determine before you've actually bought the service and experienced that system. So, for instance, right, it might be easy to buy car insurance on an open market, right? It might be easy to be like, oh, they offer this coverage and they have this price for this car insurance, right? That's probably a relatively easy thing for people to determine. However, the difficult thing is to determine, well, of this, 1,000-page long document of terms and conditions, interpreting that is probably relatively difficult for the average person. And so it's probably a good thing that the state, as a superstructure, comes in and defines some basic regulatory requirements by which you can offer car insurance to people. And I think you'd probably see similar problems with rights enforcement agencies and with police forces that were privatized.
Okay, it doesn't seem like it's that hard to judge whether you're having good rights enforcement or not. Like, similar to how it's hard to judge if you're getting good medicine or not. You have to trust a lot of expert stuff without being able to verify it. But when it comes to rights enforcement, you kind of an
medicine
expert
fails
in your
as a
rights,
market though
more or
in that
less.
way, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It doesn't seem to have the problem that medicine has. But let's say it is hard. Do you think it's going to work? Do you think that people are capable of judging whether their elected political representatives are doing a good job of constructing or regulating a legal system that provides them good rights enforcement, if they're not capable of directly judging whether they're getting good rights enforcement from a private provider?
So it's not about necessarily being able to determine if the product is good. Again, like we can probably look at like the outcome of a car insurance case and determine, oh, did my insurance company represent me well, right? It's a matter of, can the average person with reasonable technical expertise predict, based on those terms and conditions, the actual outcome of a theoretical situation in which they actually need to call upon that service, right? So this is the problem we see in medicine. This is the problem that you might be able to see in like various terms and conditions agreements. Healthcare is a classic example. But then I think when we're talking about basically insurance for your rights, this is an example where people would probably be faced with overly technical documents, lengthy pages that are hard to understand and read across the market, and they'd probably have a difficult time differentiating between the two. They might be able to look at a price and say one's cheaper than another, but answering the question of like what that actually gets you in terms of tangible outcomes would probably be difficult for the average person. And I think that to answer the question directly with regard to like a representative that's elected, determining what someone's platform is, I would agree, is difficult for the average person. However, predictably, we've formed sort of coalitions in that regard, and it's a little bit easier to determine, at that point, when you're voting for like a Democrat or a Republican, what a standard outcome is based on their rhetoric. And when it comes to what someone's preferences are politically, whether they're informed or they're not informed, we do know that those outcomes are easily predicted based on what someone's platform is. And that's a less technical process because, at least in the case of an elected representative, they're incentivized to be as dumbed down and as simple as possible in their messaging. And the outcomes, which is just votes on legislation, are also a fairly simplistic process. Whereas when it comes to, a rights enforcement agency, they're probably incentivized to do the exact opposite. That's why terms and conditions agreements are 1,000 pages long and hyper technical in their language, because the goal is to trick people into agreeing to things that they don't really understand that they're agreeing to. We probably see the same problem with the rights enforcement agency.
So if people are incapable of making informed decisions with regard to some particular service that they're buying, I don't see how they would be able to make any better decisions about who to delegate that responsibility to politically. If you don't know whether you're getting good rights enforcement from a rights enforcement company, then I don't see how you'd be able to judge whether your elected representative is doing a good job of forcing that industry to give you good service. And if you could do that, then why couldn't you just do that by hiring a private consultant to delegate those decisions to in a private market, right? I don't see how the political process can even in principle improve the decision-making abilities of individuals, because even if they're uninformed and they need to delegate the decisions to someone else, fine, then let them choose someone to delegate the decision making and hire them as a private consultant. And if they can't even choose who to hire to delegate their decisions to, then how could they possibly choose who to represent them politically, right? Where does the improvement come in?
Well, right. Again, I think that when we're talking about the voting process, we're typically talking about the legal code in general, as it's enforced, is like a cumulative structure over the course of our entire history as a nation. It's the same thing with every single other country, right? And so when people tend to vote for representatives, they don't tend to vote based on holistically the entire book of laws in general. They tend to vote based on single issues or maybe a handful of issues that are fairly easily able to resonate to them. So for instance, right, if I'm like super duper into healthcare, I might vote for a guy that, purely, he said, my healthcare plan is A and my opponent's healthcare plan is C. And then as a voter, I might say, hey, I like A more than C for one reason or another, whether it's informed or uninformed. So I'm going to vote for A despite the rest of their potential positions. And based on checks and balances and based on all these other systems that we sort of agreed on over time, tends to be the case that it results in better outcomes than otherwise. However,
what do you mean?
When you're talking about...
Hold on. Better outcomes, even if it's just you only get to make a tiny little incremental decision every election, well, fine, but that still means that everything we have is just an accumulation of these tiny incremental decisions that were made by completely uninformed people. I don't see how that would be an improvement on one big uninformed decision.
What do you mean by one? Well, no, yeah. So exactly. So that's what I was going to tie it into at the very end there. So the difference is that when it comes to rights enforcement agencies, what you have to do at that point is understand holistically, essentially an entire code of laws and rules that you would want to agree to be, essentially subservient to, or at least, accountable to, or, an ability to pull from. And I think that that's a much larger task for the average person in general, rather than these more sort of, technically trained people.
Well, you have to decide, you have to know enough to decide which one is giving you the best option. And if you can change any time, then you don't necessarily have to make the right choice right away. You can try one, and if you find a problem with it, then you switch to another one. And that, because of that constant, ongoing, easy choice, that gives the providers an incentive to, first of all, make their product understandable, to keep their laws simple, so that their customers can feel like they actually know how to judge it, right? And also to make sure, because they can instantly lose a lot of business, they have an ongoing incentive to keep their product good. Like, there's lots and lots of things that we choose that are way too complicated for us to understand, like a car or food. We don't really understand all the nutritional implications of what we eat. And yet we do see that things tend to get better in those in those industries, in those product areas, we don't find that our food is just getting like constantly more and more poisonous and killing us. We find that actually there does seem to be this pressure to make food healthy and to keep it safe. And that's because we don't have to, all we have to know is whether or not the food killed us. As long as we can figure that out, then there's a reason to make it very, very unlikely for it to kill us. As long as we know whether in the end we were happy with it, then there's a reason for the people in the market to try to make us happy as possible, even if we don't understand everything, all the reasons why it makes us happy, right? So I don't see why we wouldn't have the same problem with law. Like, we may not understand everything, all the minutiae and complexities of the service that's being provided us, but we know whether we're happy with it. We know we know how happy we are. And if we're not sure, we can switch and try something else and see if we're happier, right?
Well, I disagree
can't do that
with the first
the
part.
Political system. We can't try a different government and just see how it is.
Well, again, you're perfectly free to try other governments if you want. You just have to move,
not really.
right? Now,
it's very prohibitively expensive to do it. We can't. There's an enormous cost to trying something out. Whereas we can try a different restaurant or try a different product pretty easily. Just the cost of buying a product or shopping somewhere else.
Yeah, the issue I think fundamentally is that with what you're assuming with these contracts, you're assuming there's no transaction cost to the contract, which I think is definitely flawed, right? Obviously, well, you're assuming it would be very little, but if I had to guess,
less than the cost of immigrating to another country. That's the thing.
No. Well, I'm not comparing the two, right? This is a response to your original point, right? Which is that you can just easily switch between rights enforcement agencies, and this is not true, and it's probably not. Well, it's not true with any insurance contract, and it's probably not going to be the case with any rights enforcement agency either. You're probably going to be locked in for some period of time, right? And this is where you end up with probably some troubles in that regard. And even so, your example of food, I think, kind of doesn't really work out because, for instance, say you die of a heart attack when you're 38, right? And you think that it was because of your diet. Well, what was it? How do you know what it was? You don't, right? This is where we probably rely on regulators and, some, again, superstructures to determine that for us based on one thing or another. You can look at many different examples of across time of, things being either unhealthy or incredibly terrible for the consumer that ends up being discovered by some state actor, and some regulation ends up being relatively positive in that regard. And I just think that that's probably a better system than this incredibly decentralized set of enforcement and laws, right? So, for instance, we might imagine.
Hold on.
All right, I'm holding on.
You cover a lot, and every time, like 12 different things every time you talk. But let's go through.
All right,
one
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
All right.
I just want to address everything you said because it's all good. So, I'm not. As for food getting, the dangers of food's generally gotten healthier, and I don't saying that was the result of regulation. Like, regulation has not made our food healthier. Our food got healthier because we got more knowledge. We figured out more about healthy eating, and that knowledge became popular because people were interested in it. And we put more pressure on the people making our food to make better food. At least some of us did. And
no, but you didn't just mention health, right? You mentioned poisonous, right? So, for instance, if there was a food that slowly killed you if you ate it, right? This would be something that would be difficult for the average person to determine, and it would also be you would also be incentivized from a company perspective to hide that kind of thing, right?
But there was food that slowly killed us, and we stopped eating it because we figured out that it was slowly killing us, right?
No, I understand.
Like
there's obviously a give and take here, right? It's not that market mechanisms have no ability to determine if a food is bad or good for you, right? That's not what I'm saying, right?
I don't buy that the state helps us figure out things like that. I don't see any evidence of that.
It's not just about figuring it out. It's also about regulating it to such an extent that it would actually be broadly, beneficial for society, right? Like, it's probably a good thing.
They have to figure out before they regulate it. And it seems to me that you can just as easily have regulations which make things worse, like subsidizing, the corn industry, so we end up with more like high fructose corn syrup in our food or something like that. It's not clear that state regulation is is taking care of us in that sense, and making us
Well,
healthier.
a subsidy is different than a regulation, at least in the way that we would normally use the phrases. I understand you could frame them both as the same, but what I'm fundamentally talking about is like standards of production that, while at the same time the market, and like when we're talking about the market, we're just talking about people, right? Where like people can serve a useful purpose by which we would discover these things. However, I think that the state, as a democratically accountable body, is probably a useful tool in which to regulate these types of things whenever they crop up, right? And there are many examples of state regulations being quite beneficial to people, in general, in a way that prevents those types of either tragedies or just like these sort of micro examples of consumer, the ability to take advantage of consumers being mitigated.
And once again, if we can't judge, if we're inadequate at judging whether food is safe in some case, like if the damage is long term enough, how will we be any better at judging whether our elected representatives are good at making sure that the food is safe? That seems like strictly a more complicated, convoluted way of dealing with that problem that relies on the same people doing the same thing with the same incentives, or even worse incentives. So I don't see how it could be an improvement. Like, it seems like you're applying economic models rigorously to free market solutions to find the flaws in them, but you're not applying that same reasoning, or not applying it as rigorously to the political alternative, and looking at, if the market fails, why would a political approach, why would putting the state in between improve on that failure at all?
Right. I get what you're saying. Yeah. So I think that in general, what we would say in terms of how it would improve is, again, because I think that the mechanisms by which we would view those outcomes are probably a bit simpler when you've got a singular entity accountable to a singular body, in this case, the people in a broad democratic say, than multiple different entities competing with all of their, different and, competing terms and conditions.
What's the singular entity? The singular entity is the state. Accountable to a singular body? What's that?
Yeah.
All the people in the world?
Right? So, well, not in the world, obviously, in the the nations that we're talking about, right? So that's really what I'm referencing when I say accountable to a singular entity. In this case, it would be the democratic will of the people.
Okay, so the democratic will of the people is not, it's not a single entity, in the sense that it's not a person making one choice, right? So the reason markets fail is because of that. Because there isn't one person deciding how everything is allocated. There's a bunch of individuals making individual decisions in their own best interest. And when you have externalities, those individual self-interested decisions lead to a not optimal allocation for the entire group. Why would you not have that same problem in the political sense when you have everyone voting on one big thing? Because you're going to have the same thing. Each voter does not pay the costs or receive the benefits of their choice. Actually, their choice doesn't really have much effect on anything. But even if it did, the costs and benefits are externalized to the rest of society. So it seems like democratic decision making is like the perfect storm. It's the perfect market failure. Why would a system entirely based, where everything is accountable to that ultimately failing democratic market, be able to improve on any other failing markets? It seems like we would just have the same problem, but worse.
Well, no, not necessarily at all, right? So again, I think, I'm not sure if we're talking passing each other or what's happening here. Obviously, there's a difference between democratic say in a singular state entity and like a bunch of nebulous rights enforcement agencies trying to determine which one's better, right? So the obvious difference would be that one is, one thing and the other one's a million things, right? Now, all that I'm trying to say here, and I feel like it's just absurd not to agree with this, right, is that if we're talking about a voter's preference, right, versus a market buyer's preference of goods, right, it is clear to me that in the case of rights enforcement agencies, it would be incredibly difficult for the average person to determine amongst all of those different terms and conditions which one is optimal, much less how good their customer service is, right? However, when we're talking about a singular state entity, at the very least, you might have some technical problems, understanding. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh no,
Did I lose you?
my internet.
Whoops. I can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, okay. I was just saying that at the very least, with regard to a state entity, you might have some similar problems understanding the technicalities of what's going on in the law and everything like that. A lot of that is devolved and delegated, right? But at the very least, it's a singular code book that's accountable broadly versus all the, basically a million different code books that you'd have to pick from. And I understand what you're saying. Your response is, well, naturally you'd be incentivized to make your code book as simple and understandable as possible. Well, the issue with that is that I'm not sure how possible that necessarily is. I'm also not sure how necessarily incentivized they are to make them simple, right? Because by the same logic, all of these insurance companies would make their own terms and conditions incredibly simple, but they don't. Why don't they? Probably because it's profitable to make them complex and insert a lot of loopholes that the average person struggles to understand. And so I think similarly with an entire legal system, you'd probably have similar problems.
So it seems like you're saying the state provides a single option and that's easier to understand. But if you only have one option, it doesn't matter whether you understand it or not because you don't have a choice. Or,
well, it does matter if we assume that certain code books would probably be better for people than others, which I would assume that, and I would assume that under a democratic framework.
Okay, so if you're saying that democracy gives you a choice, is that what you're saying?
Well, no. So all I'm saying is that people would have an. I don't understand. Okay, so all I'm saying fundamentally is that when it comes to picking a rights enforcement agency, this is a process that is a hell of a lot more convoluted and complex than simply voting your conscience and your preference for an elected representative in a democracy for a code book that we all simultaneously have buy-in to and agree on, at least to some extent, obviously. Obviously, I get that not everyone agrees with every law, but we get what I'm saying here, right? So that's all I'm saying is that when you're multiplying, the understanding of the code book by 1,000, there's all these, nebulous different code books that you're choosing from. This is probably a problem that's much more difficult for the average person rather than voting for a representative in a democracy.
When you say more difficult, like it's not the difficulty that matters. It's whether you get what you want. All right. It's how much your choice actually gives you good outcomes. So like,
right. But it can be difficult to determine, like, okay, how do I put this? Right. In economics, obviously it's easy to state your preferences, right? That's basically what you seem to be describing, right? It's easy to understand your own preferences. I want this. I don't want this. I want to do this. I don't want to do this, right? What's difficult for the average consumer is at that point to look at these, presumably it's a very competitive market, these 1,000 different code books to choose from and determine, okay, based on each of their 100 or 200 or 1,000 page terms and conditions and, fully outlining all their laws by which you'd be governed, which certainly would be quite a few laws if I had to imagine, it's hard to determine, okay, based on all of these laws and all their legalese speak across all of these 1,000 different companies, what actually gives me the outcomes that I would prefer. That's what's difficult for the average person under your system, I think. And that's probably what would lead to a necessary market failure in your system.
So, okay, I think you're imagining that people are going to be choosing like all of their laws or something when they're choosing rights enforcement. That's not the case, right? What you're choosing is who does the best job at protecting you. Who comes the fastest when you call them and say, my house is being robbed or I'm under attack, who provide like simple things like that are easy to understand. There's not going to be a huge range of different kinds of laws that you can be given. Because the rights have to be. Why would there have to be?
Well, because we're not just measuring, because it's not just like who can I call to enforce my rights. There has to be an incredibly clear and technical distinction of like what rights you're actually purchasing
Yeah.
and going from there, right? So for
There
instance,
is,
like
but
there
you
would,
wouldn't have a lot
right,
of
right.
choice as a consumer about which rights you get. The rights that you're going to end up getting are going to be very similar for all the different enforcement agencies, because those agencies have to get along with each other. They can't have rules that are incompatible with each other, right? So
Well, wait,
the market's
if
going to
that's,
converge
if,
on more or less one set of rights. You might have some variations from, maybe geographical things or something, but
well,
murder is always
but
going to be
you're,
illegal. Theft's always going to be illegal. Like, it's pretty straightforward, right?
but your entire argument has been predicated on like a diversity of choice, and if this diversity is ultimately, I guess, not really there to some, like there's
The
diversity in our
choice is
code
there on
book
the margin,
amongst,
right? So if there's some
well,
ambiguity and they're not
the
sure whether the law should be quite like this or like that, and it's not clear, then the market can resolve that ambiguity, right? We're not quite sure.
there's a choice on the margin today, though, right? I mean,
Yes, there is, but we don't, as individuals, have any way of making that choice with the vote, because who you vote for does not determine what you will get.
right. And what I'm saying is, well, and I suppose this might be an area for either moving on or perhaps a conclusion. My argument would be that the dollars you pay don't necessarily determine what you get, right? Again, what we're talking about is what is probably a complex set of code books, right, that you're choosing to be governed by. And at that point, you've paid the money, but you probably didn't understand the full implications of what you're signing up for. At the very least, it's probably pretty difficult to, right? And this is why this is why insurance fraud exists. In theory, it would be impossible if people could fully understand the rules and conditions by which they're signing up for it. But it's in fact entirely possible to either be scammed by your insurance company or get a product that you didn't necessarily think you were paying for. And I think that this problem would be certainly magnified to probably a grievous degree when we're talking about enforcing, basically an entire code book. I'm not an extremist in this regard. I don't think that necessarily in an anarchist society we would, I'm not sure if every society would be plagued with murder and rape and everything like that. It'd probably be worse than it is now, but I'm not making that argument, here. It's just that you'd probably end up with a lot of inequalities based on either knowledge or background that I think would, just be worse than they are today.
Okay. I mean, I think your choice of rights enforcement, like your choice about anything else, like a car or anything complicated, can be as simple or complicated as you want to make it. Just the more effort you put into making the choice, the better you're going to get. The more accurate you're going to get at getting the better choice. And the more likely you are to get the better choice. You don't care, you can choose at random. If you care a little bit, you can put a little bit of effort into it. Put a lot, care a lot, you can put a lot of effort into it. At least you have that leeway, which some people will use, and they will actually get what they choose. With voting, you can put as much or as little effort into it as you want, but you still only get one vote. And because one vote does not have a significant effect on the outcome, your choice doesn't matter. From a perspective of an individual, it doesn't matter. So you don't have an incentive to put any effort into it, or at least and whatever effort you do put into, any benefit that comes from that is externalized to the rest of society. So you have a market failure. So no one has a reason to actually put any effort into voting, at least for the purpose of getting good policy. They might have other incentives for you to vote for that are not externalized, but those are things. Well, we won't talk about that, but the weird reasons that people.
Well, in general, we might just have different philosophical standards here, right? So I would just be.
I don't think it's philosophical.
Pretty much
it's all economics.
I think it is entirely philosophical when you boil it down in that regard, right? Because we might agree that the individual in a stated society might have relatively severe curtailments of their liberty if they view their liberty as doing certain things that society deems unfit for them to do, right? So, for instance, I referenced it in a well, how do I put this? I don't want to use the same example over and over again, but like if you view it as your liberty to, enslave your children or something like that, well, a civil society might say that, well, that's just, that's against our law, that's against our rule, right? So by that regard, you're curtailing that person's liberty to do something like that, right? Now, obviously, that's violence on another person. I get it, whatever, blah, blah, blah. The whole point is just to say that obviously we make decisions to curtail individuals' freedoms to do as they please in many respects in modern society. This would probably also be the case in any sort of anarchist society, because you can't literally do whatever you want in anarchism, at least for the most part, right? And so that's my only point, is that at least with regard to that, we probably end up with net better outcomes on the median under a democratic and stated society versus an anarchist society. It's hard to make that argument empirically. Well, I was going to say it's hard to make that argument empirically because there's not many empirical examples of like broadly adopted anarchism. But I'm safe with that bet, I guess.
I mean, I'm not aware of any examples. And if we're looking at the what we have now, if democracy does a good job at picking laws, then why do we have the war on drugs? Why do we have immigration restrictions, which are far too restrictive? Why do we have silly things like eminent domain, or speed limits that are just extortion rackets for like so many laws that are obviously wrong and terrible?
I can tell you why. I mean, well, the reality is this problem would, as you've implicitly conceded, would exist in your society as well, right? So, when you purchase a rights enforcement agency, you're purchasing a set of laws that are supplied by the market, right? Mm-hmm. So similarly, as David Friedman would say,
and you're paying
you're probably not going to be able, right? You're probably not going to be able to find a rights enforcement agency that allows you to rape and murder, because, well, there's some sort of cultural supply constriction in that regard, right? And
I would say that the cost of that law is going to be more than people are willing to pay for it. That's a better way to put it. You could imagine paying for the right to infringe on other people's rights, right? If you want to stop everyone from smoking marijuana, you could, in principle, pay for that, but you're going to be bidding against the people who want the right to smoke marijuana, and also paying for the cost of enforcing the law and actually going out and stopping people from secretly smoking marijuana, which is going to be really expensive. So the idea is that in a market like that, people who think they might want to stop other people smoking pot, when they have to pay the cost of it themselves, which is going to be very expensive, they realize, oh, okay, I don't actually care that much if other people smoke marijuana.
Right, but similarly, there might be sets of laws in those types of code books that you might prioritize over others, right? So for instance, there might be a law in a rights enforcement code that you don't agree with, but there's probably other laws that they enforce that you prioritize, right? And so similarly, when people make these arguments of, well, why is there literally any law on the code book that people tolerate if it's the case that we have sort of free and open democracy in this country, right? And my answer is that, well, it's because we have coalitions and we have people that believe in sets of laws, and you kind of get the choice thereof, right? And so, for instance, if you're a big gun guy, you're obviously probably going to end up voting for Republicans. Now, you might be a believer in like single payer healthcare. You might believe in gay rights. You might believe in a right to choose, stuff like that. But if your number one issue is guns, and you're therefore, voting for this coalition of people that believe in a certain set of laws, which is, the Republican Party, well, it turns out you're going to end up transitively supporting a lot of those things, right? And so this is the explanation why you end up with laws on the books that are aggregately unpopular, but end up still being enforced because voters prefer a certain, ideological bend that tends itself towards other things versus what they have an option to do if they were to do everything just themselves. And I think a similar coalescing of the market would exist under a system of rights enforcement agencies.
But the thing is, they don't prefer it. Nobody actually prefers the war on drugs. If you include the cost of it and if you made them pay the cost of it, no one would want to do it. That is my claim, right? And no one would actually, given the choice personally, like, do you want drugs to be illegal, but you have to pay this much extra money for it to happen? I don't think it would be illegal.
But ask them this question: if there were 100 Democrats in the Senate and 435 Democrats in the House, and Democrats as president and vice president, there wouldn't be a war on drugs. Pot would be legal. This is probably the case, right? Because they're Democrats, and Democrats are certainly the more pro-pot party than the Republican Party.
They've been since as long as drug prohibition has been around. Has that been true? I don't think so.
Well, obviously, I'm talking in a contemporary sense, right? That's how we would reasonably frame a discussion like this, right? So I'm just saying that, with regard to that question, what you should ask them is, do you believe in the war on drugs? Most people might say no, right? However, what you could ask them is, well, if you don't believe in the war on drugs, would you vote for a Democrat if it meant getting rid of the war on drugs? And you'd probably end up with a very, very different response in that regard, because a lot of the people that don't believe in the war on drugs probably prioritize other issues more than that.
So this is another problem with the state, is that you get one vote for the state, for the people in power, or maybe a few votes for different levels of government. Yeah. But that one vote affects a huge number of completely unrelated things. Right. Your laws, your services, your utilities, maybe your healthcare, and so on.
In a system,
and they're all bundled together for no particular reason.
In a system of rights enforcement agencies, you get one signature, right? And so my only...
But for one, you can choose your rights enforcement, you can choose your utilities, you can choose your healthcare, and like all these services you can choose independently. You can even choose your rights enforcement and your arbitration independently, probably to some extent.
Well, in many societies in this country, you can choose all of those things as well, right? You can choose your arbiter, you can choose your lawyer, you can choose your healthcare, you can choose your utilities. Now, I understand
they're all one provider, though, right?
No, what are you talking about? There's many different... like, for instance, in Texas, we have a deregulated utility market. You can choose whatever provider you want for your utilities. Guess what it turned out to be? Well, that regulation change ended up increasing the cost of electricity, not decreasing it. But that's
okay. But the point is that the state tends to mush a whole bunch of different industries together and force them all into one choice, right? That's what you just said. The reason we have a lot of crappy laws, one of the reasons is that people are forced to vote for a huge package of things, and they'll accept some bad things in exchange for also having some good things.
Not industries, laws, right? So it's different in that. It's very, very different in that regard, right? So my only point would be that having a single superstructure that we can all at least cumulatively understand and go from there is probably better and simpler for the average person than having a bunch of different code books from there. And to the extent that you've described rights enforcement agencies as like only different on the margin, and yes, there are probably different you probably are locked into a contract to a certain extent, to that extent that they're only different on the margin. Well, again, I would say the same thing about our current system. At the very least, you would prefer my system because it's simpler, if it's the case that it's only different on the margin anyway.
What do you mean by it's not simpler?
Because you only have one code of laws to evaluate versus 1,000. Right. I mean, this is why it's probably simpler.
But you still have to evaluate them.
No, I understand. But for instance, like, is it easier to, like, if you had to, I'm trying to think of a good example, but like, for instance, if you had to choose between, and I'm not saying this would be better, just work with me on this one, right? So for instance, if you had to choose like which soda's better, just had sodas, which one's better? You had to answer that question. Well, if you had 2 sodas to choose from, that's a relatively easy proposition. If you had 1 billion sodas to choose from, it's probably going to be a little bit difficult to truly determine, even based on your own preferences, which soda's the best, because there's 1 billion sodas you now have to try, right?
Would you rather that the government mandate one soda for everyone and then we have to vote on it? You think that would be better for the soda? You think we get better soda that way?
No. And this was the absurd sort of hypothetical that I was trying to avoid, but one that I think you've refused to engage in based on that response, right? Which is that all that I'm trying to say is that in the case of a code book where it's technically hard to understand for many people, it's difficult for the average person to grasp a lot of these things. The fact that code books have to be relatively all-encompassing because our lives and our preferences for rules and regulations are in fact relatively all-encompassing. In that regard, it would be probably very difficult for the average person to grasp and understand that type of situation from there. And that's not mentioning the perhaps plethora of other problems we might imagine with rights enforcement agencies that you could say exist with the state to a certain extent. It's just that, hey, at least with the state, you have a democratically accountable and equitably accountable body versus in a rights enforcement agency scheme where you've got these competing interests all trying to get as many customers as they can, no matter the cost, which I think would be no matter the social cost, I should say, which I think would be worse.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, I don't understand why you think that the choice that you'd be making in market justice, like in practice, you're going to be choosing between small variations at a time between different agencies, and the important thing is that choice, you can make that choice and change it. Maybe not any day, or maybe any day, who knows? You might have some sort of, there might be some transaction costs, but there's not going to be the same transaction costs that you have to change when in a state system where you have to move to a different city or maybe even a different country in order to try something else. And the complexity, there's no particular reason to think the laws themselves would be more complex, and there's no reason to think that the variations that you'd be choosing from would be any more complex than the variations that we choose from in an election. And there's no reason to think that people would people find it any easier to understand what they're choosing in an election than they understand what they're choosing in a market. I mean, I don't understand why you think that's the case. Like, people don't understand anything about what they vote for. Like, if you try to ask a typical voter about any of the policies that are up and see how deep their understanding goes, or their knowledge of the candidate they're voting for, what's their voting record, what do they stand for, this or that, you'll find that they don't really understand much of anything. Like, there's been studies done on this, right? So, yeah. And of course, none of it matters if their choice doesn't actually determine what they get. Because then the incentives don't work.
Their choice does determine what they get. They just have different priorities and packages that they choose from. By that logic, that people just don't understand anything that they're voting on. Why would you assume that the market for these systems would work then? Right? I mean,
because they have a reason.
One of the fundamental sort of components of competition is that people understand the product and can tell if it's good or bad. But if you're saying that even with only one choice they don't understand anything, why would you expect that understanding to be fundamentally altered in your system?
The reason they don't understand anything about what they're voting for is because they have no incentive to understand it, because it doesn't matter. That's the point. When people's choices actually matter, they care and they put some effort into understanding. Like, there's a cost to understanding your choice. And you can expect that people will generally spend as much understanding the choice as is at stake in the choice, right? If there's $1,000 of difference in value that you'll get depending on what car you choose, you'll expect people to spend somewhere, up to but not including $1,000 to figure out which car to buy, something like that. In democracy, the choice that you make, since it doesn't have any effect, practically speaking, on what you get as an individual, we would expect people to spend basically nothing figuring out who to vote for. And empirically, that seems to be pretty much what they do. Now, they do put some effort into it, but it seems like the thing that they're trying to get is not good governance, but rather some sort of like ceremonial righteous feeling or something from voting for the right party. But I mean, that's a whole other problem with democracy. Like, they're definitely not they're not getting the governance that they vote for, the policies that they vote for, as a result of their individual choice. So they have no reason to care. So yes, I would expect people to make better choices about their choice about in a market, as we see they obviously do in the things that are run by markets, right? People you don't find that there's not a lot of ideology about people choosing which toaster to buy off Amazon. There isn't like left-wing toasters and right-wing toasters, and people argue about them. Like, people wouldn't do that. They're like, no, I want the best toaster. Yeah. I don't.
But again, I think a lot of ANCAPs, and I don't think you mean to do this either, but I think a lot of ANCAPs try to find, they might use the best examples of competitive markets and try to apply them to every market, which I don't think is really fair, right? So obviously, a toaster is probably an easier thing to evaluate the outcomes and inputs of than an entire code of justice, right? At least in terms of how it's enforced, right? But
I mean, not really. You don't know. You don't know what you're going to get till you try the toaster. Maybe it'll break. Maybe we'll make good toast. And there's many more complicated things that we choose, and we do a better job choosing them than we do choosing who to vote for. I think we do a terrible job choosing who to vote for. We vote for terrible things, and they're consistent, and we vote for them over and over and over again. It just. So I just don't see any. There's no theoretical reason to think that democracy is a good way for people to express their choice, and there's no empirical evidence that it is either. Empirical evidence just seems like the opposite. So why wouldn't we even?
No. There's great empirical evidence that the median voter is pretty well represented, right? So again, we could quibble and say that
represented how?
Well, in terms of like the long-term policies that tend to be adopted by government, right? And so that's what I would say. There's decent empirical evidence that the median voter theorem is true.
They get the things that they vote for, as in when a candidate promises something and then they win, then they tend to actually do that thing. Sure, but the question is, are voters getting what they actually prefer? Meaning, if they actually understood the actual consequences of the policies that they're choosing, would they actually be happy? I don't think that's true, because I don't think they know what they're voting for.
Right. And I think to close out, all that I would say is that I don't think it's necessarily the case that in a system of you could say a system of choice under which, a system of like market determined distribution of justice, I guess, right? The legal code. I'm not sure it's necessarily the case that we'd expect consumers to all of a sudden become more informed, right? So, for instance, the medical industry and healthcare, right? So obviously, your healthcare directly affects you as a person, right? However, it does seem that the average person probably doesn't have a great amount of knowledge for healthcare in general, and a lot of people even don't have a lot of knowledge on the actual afflictions which affect them, right? Which is pretty ironic when you think about it. And I think it's just because humans are probably flawed creatures with different priorities. And going from there, it's difficult for the average person to conceptualize the idea of having the time or just, actually doing it to study what they need to study in order to fully understand those things, right? And so that's where a market failure exists. And I think that with regard to, at the very least, a cumulatively adopted and universally adopted legal code, we probably get a system that is at least a bit simpler to understand and a little bit more singularly accountable, at least to a broad entity, which is democratic involvement. But
how about this? If it's true that it's good to have one huge package of decisions that you just choose from, why not have, in a free market, someone could start an enterprise, a business that puts together those packages of decisions. We'll say, like, maybe it'll be like the red package and the blue package, and offer them, hey, everyone, pay like $5. We'll just give you this book that tells you all the decisions to make. If you find that's going to be easier for you, or you think it's going to make better decisions, then go ahead and buy that book and use that to choose all your decisions, or take all our recommendations, or just hire us as consultants to choose everything for you. You could do that. People would have the option to do that, but they'd also have the option of saying, I think I'll maybe go it on my own, or maybe for this one thing that I'm expert at, I'll try to make my own choice, right? It seems like that's a superset of the options that you have with a state. Like, you couldn't possibly do worse.
Well, right, but that's kind of like saying, if people have a hard time understanding healthcare, why don't they just hire a doctor so they can interpret these, vital signs and, recommend prescriptions for them? That's what we do today. It's not that it's a terrible system. However, what it is fundamentally is a market failure. And what it means to me, at least, is that there's probably an important role for a universal regulation for how we determine, what does it mean to be a doctor? What are the consequences that doctors face in terms of their potentially poor medical advice? And what are the ethical standards for what it means to be a doctor? I think that those are some questions that a unified legal code, serves a utility for from there. But I do have to leave here pretty soon. If you wanted, I don't want to just say the last thing and leave. I'd love for you to give maybe because I'll probably upload this to my channel, maybe give some final thoughts, and then I can shout myself out at the very end to your chat, and you can do the same to my YouTube video, and we just go from there.
Absolutely. Listen, buddy, it was great talking to you. I'd love to do it again sometime. There's obviously a lot we could talk about, and these are good points. It's good to talk about this with someone who really gets into it deeply.
Yeah, for sure. For anyone that is watching from my audience, I remember you might recognize last username from perhaps the earliest sort of panels on Twitch that I can recall, the ones that sort of Dylan and them started hosting. He took a bit of a break, but now he's back and he's spreading his capitalist propaganda, as I am as well, my own form of capitalist propaganda, I suppose. And for last username's audience, I'm a SocDem kind of left capitalist. I'm not a socialist, so if you ever want to see me debate a bunch of socialists, if that's your persuasion, got a ton of those debates on my channel. And if you ever want to learn sort of that, economics, I suppose, from my perspective, things like a $15 hour minimum wage, the gold standard, quantitative easing, what is it? What are its effects? That's some stuff that I cover on my channel as well in the form of my scripted analysis playlist. So go ahead and subscribe if you want, especially if you just like hearing discussions like these as well from a broad number of perspectives. But like I said, it was really fun talking to you. It was a good time.
Yep, totally, man. I'm pasting your channel into my chat right now. And
for sure. All right.
Check Econoboi out at YouTube and check me out on Twitch, I guess. So take care, man.
You too. Have a good day.
Take care. All right. Do you guys enjoy that? It's pretty good. There's always one more thing I wanted to say at the end. That's the tricky part, cutting it off. But that seems like a good sign, right? It's much better to always have more to say than to get stuck and not know what to say. But, at the end there, it would have said, fuck, what were you talking about? Something like, oh, why don't people hire doctors to make decisions? Well, they do. They go on the internet and they read doctor blogs and doctor sites to recommend things, and they pay them a little bit as advertising or whatever. You don't just go to a doctor blindly and get treatment. You do a lot of research and stuff, figuring out what's wrong with you or which doctors are good before you actually go to the doctor. So there's always industries to help people make choices, right? Markets can solve that problem too. Anywhere there's a problem, there's an opportunity for people to solve that problem and to make money doing it. And if the problem is that people don't know enough, then we have lots of ways to solve that problem too. Offering information. In fact, with the internet, we have more solutions to that than we've ever had before.